full committee hearing on cybersecurity. And this comes within our purview on this committee. And I mean, not trying to be dramatic about it, when the internet was invented, everybody fell flat in their face. They were so thrilled. And the world began to do business in a different way. Now, both the President Bush's Director of National Intelligence, Mike McConnell, who I greatly respect, and President Obama's Director of National Intelligence, Admiral Blair, who I greatly respect, have labeled cybersecurity perpetrated through the internet as the #1 national hazard of attack on the homeland in West Virginia, America, or anywhere else. So, I mean, it really almost makes you ask the question, would it have been better if we'd never invented the internet and had to use paper and pencil or whatever? And that's a stupid thing to say, but it has genuine consequence, because it's on the internet that these acts of shutting down, they have the television saying that, ads every day saying that the Department of Defense is attacked 3 million times a day, and it's true. Everybody is attacked. Anybody can do it. People say, well, it's China and Russia, but there could be, some kid in Latvia doing the same thing. I mean, it's an individual act. It doesn't require a sleeper cell. It doesn't require any, ammonia or explosives. It's just an act. And yet it's an act which can shut this country down. Shut down its electricity system, its banking system, shut down really anything that we have to offer. It is an awesome problem. On the Intelligence Committee, we were taken for a full day to discuss, to a undisclosed place in Virginia to discuss this. It is a fearsome, awesome problem, to speak. I mean, obviously it's broader than that too. I wonder where this stands with you, what your thoughts are, and what you think we ought to be doing about it.
Senator, cybersecurity is obviously of utmost importance.
Duro. Sobre la roca, escrito, clara y de manera totalmente legible, hay un mensaje escondido en las colinas de Elbert Country, en Georgia, Estados Unidos. En esa zona se alza un enorme y colosal monumento que está grabado en casi su totalidad con unos misteriosos mensajes. Pero ¿cuál es el mensaje que incorpora dicha roca? Ni más ni menos que unos mandamientos, unas órdenes, unas guías, los 10 mandamientos del nuevo orden mundial. Y vamos a analizarlos punto a punto. ¿Qué está escrito en aquella roca? En el primer mandamiento dice lo siguiente: mantener la humanidad por debajo de 500 millones en perpetuo equilibrio con la naturaleza. 500 millones de habitantes. Mensaje porque el que claramente se está instando a destruir a 12 de cada 13 personas del planeta, cuya cifra actual ronda los 7.000 millones. Una eliminación, una despoblación del planeta por parte de los seres humanos, hacia los propios seres humanos.
are forcing on us types of
Yeah,
chemicals?
well, Americans are mostly forcing it, you know, the American companies, but with gene-modified food and things like that, and we do not know, and nobody knows what's going to happen, because they experiment on long range, and we don't know what happens in a year or 20 years. Just like we don't know what happens, except we start knowing now, what happens with mobile phones in 20 years. You know, they cause brain tumors and blindness and deafness and cancer and whatever. It's totally, totally known. But it's experimentation on a long range.
Do you think that those frequencies and those devices are specifically selected to test on us? Do you think they're changing the species, or trying to kill us, or change us, or whatever?
Well, at least they're making us very sick. And since the goal that I have read of the elite, if I can use that word, is to diminish our population on planet Earth by at least 2/3, maybe even 5 billion. So that's very, very
Can you
negative.
explore that more? I mean, we're facing this new disease which is coming out, the
Swine?
the swine flu.
Oh, that's just rubbish.
What's
I mean,
your-
that
what's
is
your-
really rubbish. You know, it's not the swine flu that's dangerous, it's the injections. Because it's supposedly, it's not only swine, but it is human virus mixed with swine virus, mixed with bird virus. And of course, behind the whole thing is to diminish world population, because it's very toxic, and to get milliards and milliards and milliards into the pockets of those who put them out. Rumsfeld is an owner also in one of the big drug companies. And since they want to diminish the population, so they start saying that children and pregnant women are the first ones. Eliminate the next generation.
We had a chance to talk to Dr. Russell Blaylock, MD, a retired neurosurgeon and author. His trailblazing research has tirelessly documented the fact that there is an epidemic of neurological disorders in the Western world, directly tied to toxins in our environment, and the story behind the story concerning the larger global eugenics program behind population reduction.
I'm Dr. Russell Blaylock. I'm a board-certified neurosurgeon. I've retired from active practice. Now I do primarily theoretical research in neurosciences and spend most of my time writing research articles, review articles on neuroscience projects at the present time. What I found interesting in all of this when I first started looking at it, looking at the funding by the Rockefeller Foundation and many of the other foundations like Ford Foundation, the Carnegie Foundation, and looking back into the history of it, and I came accidentally upon a book by Dr. Lily Kay. She was doing a research project looking at the origins of molecular biology in the United States. And that was primarily my interest, was just reviewing the history of molecular biology. But to my surprise, much of the book describes the, what was called the Science of Man project by the Rockefeller Foundation. And primarily, and this is in the period about 1910, primarily what he was interested in, and his foundation board, was doing social engineering. They were concerned that society was made of a lot of people they considered undesirables. Their definition of undesirables was people that had lower IQ, people that had physical defects, people who had diseases, people who did not behave in a way that these group of elitists thought people should behave in a society. So their idea was to use eugenics, which was the primary science at the time, to redevelop man, to create a new type of person. And they coined the term social engineering. Now, of course, at that time, we didn't have DNA as a concept. So they were using rather crude genetics to bring this about. in the very beginning. So what she shows is the Rockefeller Foundation was really putting a lot of money in this. And in order to do that, he thought, what I'll do is I will fund major universities. And he picked Caltech as one of those universities, and then some in the East like Harvard and Johns Hopkins and Columbia, University of Chicago as the primary centers where this type of study would be carried out and how to engineer human beings to be in the form that they thought humans should be. And gradually, as science began to become more sophisticated, and eugenics began to get a really bad name as the period of Adolf Hitler occurred, and you realize that the Rockefeller eugenicists, before Hitler became well-known in power, they were traveling to Germany and exchanging information on these eugenic programs. So a fair amount of this information came from the Rockefeller Foundation. Of course, after World War II, when the world found out a lot of what was going on in eugenics and the horror of eugenics, most of these programs were abandoned, and the Rockefeller Foundations very quickly said to all their members, let's never use the name eugenics anymore. What we'll talk about is social engineering, the new science of man, behavioralism. So they had these key words that meant basically the same type idea, that is redesigning man and man's behavior and controlling it through elitist ideas, but we would do it through new science. And we would establish major institutions in the United States that would control medical education through his General Education Board, which was a very powerful foundation regulation of education in America. And so he would appoint professors that would be directors of these programs. He groomed people who believed, like he did, that in fact man should be redesigned. We need this science of man to re-engineer human beings, but do it in a more scientific way than this crude eugenics program that he began with. And what that necessitated was using what was called molecular biology. Well, with the discovery of DNA, this became more sophisticated in that you could manipulate certain genes and change how the brain functioned. And of course, then they got into the neuroscience field itself and began to look at, well, how does the brain work? How can we change behavior by altering brain function? And this has led up to the present day when we have things like the decade of the brain, where there's intense study of the behavioral functions of the brain and how it works. But if you look through her book where she talks about the actual funding, their actual ideas, it's the same theme that started back in 1910. That is, we're going to recreate man in our image, what we think man should be, how people should think, what they should think, the limitations on their behavior. It's a true scientific social engineering of human beings. Well, leading from that, when we start looking at, well, look at some of the programs that have sort of spurred out of this. You know, the high-tech DNA manipulation, brain manipulation through electrodes or through transmission outside of electrodes to change human thinking. These are the more sophisticated programs that are a little bit more obvious, but then there's things that are less obvious. For instance, fluoridating water. We look at the original justification for fluoridating water back in 1945 when they picked a couple of cities, Grand Rapids, Michigan, and Muskegon. Grand Rapids was going to be fluoridated, Muskegon was not, and they were going to compare and use the idea that fluoride was preventing cavities. So even before the study had been completed, they announced that it was a grand success and that fluoridated water produced a 30 to 60% reduction in cavities. What they didn't say was that in the unfluoridated city, there was a very similar drop in the incidence of cavities as well. And in fact, throughout the entire world, we began to see in the developed world a tremendous fall in the incidence of dental cavities. That had nothing to do with fluoride. What it had to do with was the increased intake of calcium, mainly through cheese consumption, and better diets, better oral hygiene. And a number of studies proved that, one of which was conducted by the U.S. Public Health Service. It was one of the largest American studies at the time. They looked at 39,000 school children, in which they looked at the effect of fluoridation versus non-fluoridation, and they found it had no beneficial effect at all. Well, they hid that document so scientists couldn't examine it, and the public and the media would never see it. Well, Dr. Yamanyanis, who is a chemist, filed a Freedom of Information lawsuit, had it released, and then he saw why they wanted to hide it, and that's because it clearly demonstrated fluoride did not reduce cavities. Since that time, there's been a number of studies, one of which included 8 countries, another which included all studies on fluoride, independent studies on fluoride and dental caries for the past 30 years. Another study included 400,000 children in India. All of these studies showed the same thing. Adding fluoride to water did not reduce cavities at all. And in fact, several of the studies it showed it increased cavities. And it did so because it weakened the dental layer of the tooth and made it more prone to become cavities. So now that we've established, and it's admitted by the National Science Foundation study, which was recently completed, that fluoridating water does not reduce cavities. There's no modern evidence whatsoever that fluoridating water reduces cavities at all. So you have to ask the question, well, why are you still fluoridating water? Now, European countries have caught on very quickly. None of them fluoridate their water. Britain fluoridates about 60% of its water, and it forced fluoridation on Ireland. But the mainland European countries do not fluoridate water, do not allow it. But the United States, we still have the federal government and in collusion with the American Dental Association going to various cities, even small cities, using their pressure, their money, taxpayer money, to try to force local city councils to fluoridate the water. In the state of California, in fact, they've ordered the fluoridation of all waters in every city and village over 10,000 inhabitants, whether they vote to not fluoridate their water or not. So you have to ask the question, well, now that scientifically we've proven that fluoridating water has no effect on reducing cavities, why is the federal government spending so much money and effort to force fluoridation of the rest of the water supply? And even insisting that bottled water be fluoridated, that no one would have access to unfluoridated water except the elite. Well, if we look at the scientific studies on what is the effect of fluoridation, well, we know fluoridating water through a number of studies, some of which were ordered by the federal government itself in the earlier days, increases cancer risk. Burke and Yamanyanis, 2 scientists, did one of the largest cancer studies in relationship to fluoridating water supply. They looked at all cities, 10 cities in the eastern part of the United States. And they showed that in fluoridated cities, as compared to unfluoridated, there was a 10% increase in cancer. This was a criticized study, so they repeated it, and they did all cities east of the Mississippi, above 10,000 population, comparing fluoridated and unfluoridated. Now, what they did, they compared the cancer statistics before fluoridation and then 13 to 17 years after fluoridation. Again, they found there was a 10% increase cancer death incidence in the cities that had been fluoridated. Now, when you say cancer death incidence, that means people who died of cancer. You can appreciate there's going to be a lot more people who developed cancer who didn't die. So the actual cancer incidence is much higher. This study was so impressive to some members of Congress, they ordered a study of this link to cancer. through the Battelle Research Institute. These studies showed that, number one, it produced a number of types of cancer, one which was a very rare liver cancer, and it significantly increased the growth of cancer in people who already had cancers. Well, despite these studies, they're still fluoridating water. They found out it increased fractures, not only in the elderly, but in younger women. And it increased hip fractures in older men to a greater extent than the women. Well, a hip fracture in someone over 65 has a high mortality rate. So it's a good way, if you wanted to increase the mortality of the elderly and get them out of the way, which is in discussion today. We know that it has profound effects on the brain. One of the most impressive was done by Dr. Phyllis Mullenix, who was a highly regarded neurotoxicologist, someone who studies the toxicity of different elements on the brain. Well, she was drafted into doing this when she worked for the Forsyth Dental Research Institute. And she had never worked with fluoride, didn't know a lot about it. Now, I know this firsthand because I've interviewed her and talked with her, and I know her. And she said when she first was going to do the research project to see if fluoridating water had any effect on the brain's function, she thought it would be negative. She didn't think fluoride would have any adverse effects on the brain. She did one of the largest studies that's been done in animals to see the effect of fluoridating water on their brain function. And she used a very innovative modern technique. And in this technique, she used computers to see the behavior of the animal so that it was totally objective. There was no subjective influence by the researcher themselves. That had never been done before, and all this was high-tech equipment. She completed her study, and to her surprise, the fluoride produced two main effects. If you fed the fluoride to a pregnant animal, the offspring then became hyperactive. In other words, like ADHD. If you gave the fluoride after birth, the animal became very lethargic, sort of like a couch potato, didn't really want to do anything, became very apathetic acting. So this was a very clear effect with objective, computerized evaluation of the behavior of these animals. She used over 500 animals. She completed this research, and she also measured the fluoride levels in the animal's brain and found some very interesting things. It's that fluoride tends to accumulate in the part of the brain that controls behavior, particularly the hippocampus and the other limbic areas of the brain. She brought this research to the National Institutes of Health. They asked her to present this and the results of her research. Well, at the same time, after she wrote up her research, she had presented it in one of the very prestigious journals to be published. And they didn't know it. So she presented it to the National Institute of Health, and their response was very cold. And she said when she was walking through the National Institutes of Health, all the walls were adorned with big posters proclaiming the effectiveness of fluoridation of water and promoting the fluoridation of water. And she said, this isn't a very objective audience I'm speaking to. Well, they were very hostile and very cold to her during her presentation and didn't even ask questions. So when she got back to her institute, they asked her about sending this to a journal to be published. And they wanted the name of the journal. Well, she wouldn't tell them because she knew they would try to stop the publication, try to influence the journal not to publish it. So she wouldn't tell them, and it was published, much to their dismay and anger, and a wide audience of scientists began to look at this research, which for the first time proved that fluoride added to water in the concentrations that humans are exposed to was producing profound changes in the brain and altering behavior of young animals exposed to it. We have to realize at the time women were adding fluoridated water to reconstitute the baby food. Well, over half of babies get reconstituted baby food. They're not breastfed. So this was tens of millions of babies were being exposed to concentrations of fluoride that were used in this experiment. Where she, after they found that this had been published, they fired her. And the Forsyth Dental Research Institute, in fact, about that time, had gotten a $250,000 grant from the Colgate Company, which fluoridates their toothpaste. So she was fired from her job. She's never gotten another federal grant. And she was one of the top neurotoxicologists in the world. She had created this innovative new system. Well, she went back to her lab to get the rats' brains so that she could continue research on her own. It turns out they had flooded the lab, claimed there was a break in a water pipe. It destroyed her computer system, and they killed all the rats and incinerated them. So there is no tissue left to do any studies on. All of these things look rather suspicious, so you know, you have to come to your own conclusion. What does this mean? Number one, we know that there's numerous health effects of adding fluoride to water. We know fluoride bioaccumulates in the human body. That means it just keeps getting higher and higher concentrations the more you drink water. If you want to produce the highest concentration of a mineral, you don't put it in the food, you put it in the water, because people drink a lot of water, particularly in warm climates. So that produces the highest level of bioaccumulation, and that's what we were seeing. Well, Dr. Yamagiannis did some studies and looked at the different tissues in the body, found out the highest accumulation was in the thyroid gland. It had been known that one way to reduce thyroid function was to put fluoride in the water, that it produced a significant hypothyroidism, or low function of the thyroid gland. Now, not only does that produce lethargy, apathy, weakness, tiredness in adults, but if you do it in pregnant women, the babies are born with low IQs and they never recover. So even mild reduction of thyroid function in pregnant women has now been shown to produce significant neurobehavioral problems in their offspring. So we've got some rather profound problems with fluoridation that are now well documented from laboratories all over the world without any question. For instance, one of them Dr. Varner did out of Europe, in which he looked at 0.5 parts per million, which is half of what's put in water, and found significant death of neurons in the brain and damage to the blood vessels that supply blood to the brain. He's a highly regarded researcher. It was published in a very prestigious neurological journal. So we have all of these studies proving that this is a very hazardous thing to do, that it produces behavioral changes, many of which we're seeing in the populations that are drinking fluoridated water. We know it bioaccumulates, it gets worse over time. We know that it's absorbed into the plants and the foods, and the concentration in the foods is rising significantly. Yet we have a government that is still pushing as hard as they can, using taxpayer money, to get all the water supply in the United States fluoridated. So I leave it to the audience to think for themselves, what could possibly be the justification for doing such a thing? If you've demonstrated it doesn't reach its objective, that is reducing cavities, which everybody now has admitted, even the ADA has had to admit it, why is it still being added to the water? If it has these profound health effects, why is it still being added to the water?
Уважаемые граждане России, дорогие ветераны, товарищи солдаты и матросы, сержанты и старшины, мичманы и прапорщики, товарищи офицеры, генералы и адмиралы. Поздравляю вас с Днем Победы, с торжеством, в котором слились воедино радость, память и скорбь. В этом году исполняется 75 лет с начала Великой Отечественной войны. 22 июня 1941-го нацисты вероломно напали на Советский Союз. В один миг изменилась жизнь огромной страны. И на этом трагическом переломе был только один, но высший выбор. Главным для всего народа стало спасение Отечества. Началась героическая и жертвенная дорога к победе. Нужно было без промедления решать множество сложнейших задач. Одна из них – эвакуация миллионов мирных граждан промышленности на восток. И все это в тяжелейших условиях наступления врага в пекле войны. Сейчас трудно даже осознать, какими запредельными усилиями было вывезено и восстановлено более 1500 заводов. Уже через несколько месяцев они начали бесперебойно поставлять на фронт танки, самолеты, боеприпасы, военную технику. Это величайшая, беспримерная трудовая победа позволила нашей армии обратить врага вспять, сокрушить агрессора, который поставил себе на службу экономический потенциал почти всей Европы. В подвигах фронтовиков и тружеников тыла проявилась истинная жизненная сила нашего народа, его единство, победный дух и любовь к родной земле. Наши отцы и деды одолели мощного, беспощадного врага, перед которым спасовали, отступили многие страны. Именно советский народ принес свободу другим народам. И именно от нашего солдата нацисты и их пособники получили полное возмездие. За миллионы жертв, за все изуверства и бесчинства на нашей земле. Война длилась без малого 4 года и стала целой эпохой для нашей страны. Эпохой мужества и отваги, тяжелейших испытаний и трагических потерь, светлых надежд и беспредельной веры в победу. Великая Отечественная навсегда останется выдающимся, священным подвигом нашего народа, призывом жить по совести, держать высоту правды и справедливости, передавать эти ценности от поколения к поколению. Уважаемые товарищи, уроки истории говорят о том, что мир на планете не утверждается сам по себе, что нужно быть бдительными, что недопустимы двойные стандарты, близорукое потакание тем, кто вынашивает новые преступные замыслы. Сегодня цивилизация вновь столкнулась с жестокостью и насилием. Терроризм стал глобальной угрозой. Мы обязаны победить это зло. И Россия открыта для объединения усилий с другими государствами. Готова работать над созданием современной, внеблоковой системы международной безопасности. Наши солдаты и командиры доказали, что они достойные преемники героев Великой Отечественной и с честью защищают интересы Родины. Уверен, что сегодня ветераны гордятся своими внуками и правнуками. Они их не подводят и всегда будут держать равнение на великую победу, на подвиг доблестного поколения победителей. С праздником вас! С Днем Великой Победы! Ура!